Before London existed, the Thames existed. The great river moved through its wide valley with the quiet authority of something that has never needed to hurry, its tidal waters rising and falling twice daily along muddy banks lined with reeds, willows, and the occasional wading bird. Celtic communities had lived alongside these banks for centuries, crossing the river at points where its width and depth made fording possible, building their lives around the rhythms of water, season, and agriculture in ways that left almost no permanent mark upon the landscape. The Thames was not simply a geographical feature to these communities. It was a boundary, a resource, a sacred presence, powerful enough to receive offerings thrown into its depths by people seeking favor from whatever forces they believed controlled the natural world.
Fresh vegetables, come and
Roman
buy!
writers who eventually documented
How
this
much
region
for the
before
cloth?
conquest
$2
described
silver,
the
good
landscape
price!
of forests and marshes, of scattered settlements.
Behold the
connected by
traitor's
trackways,
face!
My lord,
rather
stay
than
your hand!
engineered
Heed her
roads.
words,
Of
villain!
communities
Justice
that could
demands
not have
blood!
imagined
Then
what was
face me
about to
if you
happen
dare!
to their
So
world.
be it!
What made this particular stretch of river special was something a trained military engineer would immediately recognize. The point where tidal waters became a narrow lift bridge without
Fine wares from the
extraordinary
north!
engineering effort,
Indeed,
while
a
remaining deep
thriving
enough to
port.
accommodate the ocean-going
Fresh goods,
trading
best in the
vessels that
city.
moved goods
A
throughout
fine
the
day
Roman
for
world's
trade.
commercial networks. This combination of bridgeable width and navigable depth made one specific location on the Thames almost predestined for importance. A great empire was approaching. The Romans arrived in Britain under Emperor Claudius in 43 AD, and within just a few years, their practical military intelligence had identified the Thames crossing point that would anchor their new province's entire infrastructure. The settlement they established there, Londinium, grew with remarkable speed from a military bridgehead into a genuine commercial center, its location at the tidal limit of the Thames making it a natural meeting point between ocean-going trade and inland river navigation. Roman engineers constructed a timber bridge across the river, the first structure to physically connect the northern and southern banks at this location, and the roads that spread outward from the bridgehead in multiple directions quickly became the arteries along which British commerce and Roman military power circulated throughout the new province. Merchants followed the soldiers, as they always did throughout the Roman world, establishing warehouses, workshops, and trading premises along the riverfront where goods arriving by ship from the continent could be transferred to road vehicles heading inland. A forum and basilica gave the settlement its administrative identity, providing the marketplace and civic buildings that Roman urban design considered essential components of any proper city. Within just a generation of Claudius's invasion, Londinium had transformed from nothing into one of the most commercially active settlements in Roman Britain, its population growing rapidly as economic opportunity attracted ambitious people from across the empire. Its first great test, however, was coming sooner than anyone could have anticipated. Around 60 or 61 AD, a queen named Boudica led the Iceni tribe of eastern Britain in a devastating revolt against Roman rule that began with legitimate grievances about broken promises, stolen land, and brutal treatment by Roman officials following the death of her husband, King Prasutagus. Boudica's forces swept through Roman Britain with terrifying momentum, destroying Camalodunum, modern Colchester, before turning toward the growing settlement of Londinium. The Roman governor Paulinus, outnumbered and unable to defend the city in time, made the agonizing decision to abandon Londinium to its fate, rather than risk his entire military force in a battle he could not win. Those civilians who could not or would not flee faced catastrophic consequences when Boudica's warriors arrived. Archaeological evidence discovered beneath modern London's streets tells the story with remarkable directness. A layer of reddish-brown ash and burned debris dating to this precise period, found consistently at sites throughout the ancient city's footprint, representing the physical remains of a settlement deliberately and thoroughly destroyed. Ancient accounts suggest Londinium was razed entirely, its population killed or enslaved, its buildings reduced to the ash layer that archaeologists encounter today. By any reasonable measure, London's story should have ended there, in fire and defeat, before it had barely begun. Instead, the Romans rebuilt. Within years, Londinium was rising from its ashes, larger, more ambitiously planned, and more deliberately constructed than the settlement that had been destroyed. London refuses to disappear. The rebuilt Londinium that emerged from the destruction of Boudica's revolt was a more serious, more deliberately constructed version of its predecessor, reflecting Roman determination to establish a genuinely permanent and impressive provincial capital rather than simply a convenient commercial outpost. At its second-century peak, Londinium was home to perhaps 45,000 to 60,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the Western Roman Empire outside Italy itself. A magnificent basilica, the largest building north of the Alps at the time of its construction, dominated the forum at the city's commercial heart. Bathhouses provided the social and hygienic infrastructure that Romans considered essential to civilized life. A substantial defensive wall, sections of which still stand within the modern city, enclosed the settlement within a perimeter of stone that represented both genuine military thinking and a powerful statement about permanence and authority. The riverside developed into a sophisticated port infrastructure, with timber quays extending into the Thames and warehouses backing the waterfront in an organized commercial district that handled goods arriving from across the empire. Evidence of international trade found at London's Roman sites, amphorae from Spain and North Africa, pottery from Gaul and Germany, glass from the Eastern Mediterranean, demonstrates the truly cosmopolitan character of this Romano-British city. Yet even as Londinium reached these impressive heights, forces far beyond its control were already beginning the long process that would eventually transform the empire supporting it. Rome itself was beginning to fall. Roman Britain's end came not through dramatic military defeat, but through gradual withdrawal, as the empire's cascading crises during the late 4th and early 5th centuries required troops stationed in distant provinces to be recalled for more pressing deployments closer to the imperial heartland. By 410 AD, the Emperor Honorius reportedly told British cities to look to their own defense, a remarkable acknowledgement that imperial protection could no longer be guaranteed. Londinium, which had by this point been renamed Augusta, experienced the collapse of Roman urban life over subsequent decades in ways that archaeology makes visible but history struggles to fully explain. The population declined dramatically. Civic buildings fell into disrepair without the administrative machinery to maintain them. The sophisticated infrastructure of roads, sewers, and public buildings that Roman investment had created slowly deteriorated. What happened to the city's population during this period remains genuinely unclear, with some scholars suggesting gradual dispersal into surrounding countryside, while others point to evidence of continued, if much reduced, occupation within the former city walls. The remarkable thing about this transitional period is not the decline, which was happening throughout the Western Roman Empire simultaneously, but the fact that the location itself retained significance even after the administrative city that had made it famous essentially ceased to function. The rivers kept flowing, the roads kept connecting. The crossing point that had originally attracted Roman engineers remained as strategically valuable as it had ever been. New kingdoms were rising to reshape what Rome had left behind. The centuries following Rome's departure from Britain saw the landscape reorganized by waves of migration and conquest that gradually transformed Roman Britain into early medieval England. Germanic settlers, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes arriving from continental Europe established their own communities throughout the former Roman province, often deliberately avoiding the ruins of Roman cities they found alien and perhaps spiritually threatening. Archaeological evidence suggests that the walled area of former Londinium was largely avoided by early Anglo-Saxon settlers, who instead established their own trading settlement called Lunwick, approximately 1 mile to the west, centered around what is now Covent Garden. This settlement grew into a significant Anglo-Saxon trading center during the 7th and 8th centuries, commercially active and populous enough to attract the attention of Scandinavian raiders whose longships began appearing on British coastal waters with increasing frequency throughout the 9th century. Viking raids devastated Londonwick repeatedly, their shallow draft vessels perfectly suited to penetrating river systems that provided direct access to valuable inland settlements. King Alfred the Great, recognizing that the open settlement outside the old Roman walls was indefensible against seaborne attack, made the strategic decision in 886 to relocate the population back within the protective stone walls of the former Roman city, effectively refounding London within its ancient defensive perimeter. This combination of Alfred's strategic vision and the ongoing Viking threat gave London its medieval configuration. But a far more total transformation of English society was still approaching, gathering itself across the narrow waters of the English Channel. October 14, 1066. The Battle of Hastings ended with King Harold II dead on the battlefield, an arrow, according to tradition, through his eye, and William of Normandy the effective master of England before he had set foot in London itself. The speed of the subsequent political transformation was extraordinary. William moved toward London with deliberate caution rather than immediate assault, recognizing that the city's submission required negotiation and implicit threat rather than costly direct attack. London's citizens, practical and commercially minded, even in crisis, submitted and offered their city to the conqueror, who confirmed their existing rights and privileges in exchange for recognition of his kingship. William understood immediately that London's wealth and population made it essential to controlling England, but he also understood that a city this large and commercially powerful needed managing rather than simply dominating. He constructed a formidable stone keep beside the Thames at the city's southeastern corner, the structure that became the Tower of London, simultaneously providing a defensive stronghold and an unmistakable architectural statement about Norman power and permanence. The Normans brought with them organizational sophistication, architectural ambition, and the French language that would profoundly reshape English culture over subsequent generations. London's commercial life continued largely uninterrupted by the political transition, its markets, guilds, and trading relationships proving more durable than any particular ruling dynasty. The medieval city that would grow from this Norman foundation was beginning to flourish in directions that even William's formidable intelligence could not entirely have predicted. Medieval London grew into one of Europe's most commercially significant cities, its strategic position on the Thames making it the natural hub for England's increasingly sophisticated trading networks, connecting the country to continental markets and eventually to more distant commercial destinations. The guilds, organizations of craftspeople and merchants organized by trade, became central institutions of medieval London's economic and social life, regulating quality standards, training apprentices, providing mutual support to members, and collectively wielding political influence within the city's governance structures that sometimes rivaled royal authority in practical importance. Specialist markets throughout the city concentrated particular trades in specific locations, creating the kind of geographic commercial logic that still influences London's neighborhood identities today. Smithfield hosted livestock markets. Billingsgate handled fish. Cheapside served as the great general market, around which London's commercial heart pulsed with daily
Fresh
activity.
vegetables, come and
The physical
buy.
fabric of medieval London
How
was
much for the
dominated
cloth?
by timber-framed
Two silver,
buildings
good price.
packed tightly along narrow streets whose widths reflected pedestrian and horse-drawn traffic rather than any modern conception of urban planning. Churches were extraordinarily numerous, their spires and towers defining the skyline in every direction, reflecting both genuine religious devotion and the commercial wealth that funded elaborate ecclesiastical buildings as expressions of civic and merchant pride. London Bridge, rebuilt in stone beginning in 1176 and subsequently developed into a remarkable structure with shops and dwellings built directly upon it, became one of medieval Europe's most distinctive urban landmarks. Yet prosperity and density together created conditions that made London extraordinarily vulnerable to the invisible enemy that was already moving westward from Central Asia. The Black Death arrived in England in 1348, carried by trading ships from continental Europe, where it had already been devastating populations for several years, with catastrophic mortality rates. London, as England's largest and most densely populated city, with the most extensive trading connections to affected continental ports, was among the earliest and most severely impacted locations in the country. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find language adequate to describing what they witnessed as the disease spread through London's crowded streets, tenements, and parishes with devastating speed. The dead accumulated faster than burial could keep pace with, requiring emergency mass burial sites outside the city walls where bodies could be interred with some degree of respectful efficiency despite the overwhelming scale of mortality. Estimates of London's death toll during this initial outbreak vary among historians, but scholarly consensus suggests the city may have lost between a third and half of its entire population within a single year, a demographic catastrophe of a kind that is genuinely difficult to comprehend in modern terms. Social and economic disruption accompanying this mortality was profound and lasting, with labor shortages, disrupted trade networks, and collective psychological trauma reshaping English society in ways that historians continue studying and debating. London's extraordinary quality of persistence now faced its most severe biological test. Families were destroyed. Streets that had bustled with daily commercial energy fell quiet. Yet the city that had survived Boudica's fire and Rome's departure was not finished. The city lives on. The Tudor dynasty that came to power following Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 oversaw a London that was expanding, rebuilding its population following the repeated devastations of plague, and increasingly asserting itself as the clear political, commercial, and cultural capital of a kingdom gradually defining its own national identity. Henry VIII's dramatic break with Rome during the 1530s had particularly profound consequences for London's physical and institutional landscape. The dissolution of the monasteries transferred enormous quantities of church property throughout the city and surrounding areas into new hands, reshaping neighborhoods, creating new residential and commercial development opportunities, and permanently altering the relationship between religious and secular authority throughout English society. Printing technology, introduced to England by William Caxton in the 1470s and rapidly adopted by London's commercially minded community, transformed the distribution of information throughout English society in ways that gradually created new possibilities for literacy, religious debate, political argument, and cultural expression. London's population continued growing throughout the Tudor period, attracting migrants from throughout England and from continental Europe, including Protestant refugees fleeing religious persecution who brought specialized skills in textile production, printing, and other crafts that enriched the city's economic and cultural life. The royal court's presence in and around London drew aristocratic families who built elaborate houses along the Strand, the road connecting
Behold the
city to
traitor's
Westminster,
face!
My
creating
lord,
a
stay your
continuous
hand.
ribbon of
Heed her
wealth and
words,
power
villain.
along the
Justice
Thames's
demands
northern
blood.
bank.
Then face me if
Playwright
you
of
dare!
genius
So
was
be
about
it!
to transform English culture. In the 1590s, a writer from Stratford-upon-Avon named William Shakespeare was producing plays for London audiences that would prove among the most enduring artistic achievements in the entire history of the English language. The Globe Theatre, constructed on the South Bank in 1599 from timber partly salvaged from an earlier playhouse, became the venue most associated with Shakespeare's greatest works. Its open-air yard packed with standing spectators from every social level, while wealthier audience members occupied covered galleries around the circular structure. Elizabethan and Jacobean London was a city of extraordinary creative energy, producing not only Shakespeare, but a remarkable generation of playwrights, poets, composers, and artists whose work reflected and shaped an English cultural identity increasingly confident in its own distinctive character and achievements. The theater district that developed south of the Thames, beyond the former jurisdiction of the city of London, often regarded theatrical entertainers with suspicion, became a genuinely cosmopolitan entertainment zone, attracting Londoners of every social level alongside visitors from provincial England and continental Europe. Yet this creative flourishing existed within a city that also experienced regular epidemic disease, stark social inequality, political tension, and the physical dangers of an environment built primarily from timber with inadequate water supply and almost no systematic approach to fire prevention. The globe itself burned down in 1613 when a theatrical cannon misfired during a performance. It was a minor episode in London's continuing relationship with fire. A far greater disaster was coming, one that would test London's resilience more severely than anything since Boudica. In the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, a fire began in a bakery on Pudding Lane near the northern end of London Bridge. In itself, this was not unusual. Fires were common in medieval London's densely packed timber-built streets, and most were extinguished before causing significant damage. This one was different. A prolonged drought throughout the preceding summer had left London's wooden buildings extraordinarily dry and combustible. Strong easterly winds drove the flames westward through streets too narrow to provide effective fire breaks. The Lord Mayor's initial response proved fatally inadequate, famously dismissing the blaze as something a woman could extinguish. By the time authorities recognized the genuine scale of the emergency and began implementing desperate countermeasures, including demolishing buildings to create fire breaks, the fire had developed unstoppable momentum. It burned for 4 days, consuming approximately 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the buildings of the City of London within the old Roman walls. The human death toll was remarkably small, given the scale of destruction, with most residents able to flee with some possessions, but the psychological and economic impact was shattering. A city that had taken centuries to build had been reduced to smoldering rubble within 4 days. Samuel Pepys, whose famous diary provides some of the most vivid surviving eyewitness accounts of the disaster, recorded scenes of extraordinary devastation that left him genuinely uncertain whether London could ever recover. From the ashes, however, something new was already beginning. The rebuilding of London following the Great Fire was one of the most ambitious urban reconstruction projects in European history, transforming the physical character of the city's core within just a few decades through a combination of legislative planning, architectural ambition, and commercial energy that reflected London's extraordinary economic vitality even in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe. The principal architectural achievement of the rebuilding was Christopher Wren's new St. Paul's Cathedral, whose massive dome became and remains one of London's most recognizable and beloved landmarks, a symbol of civic renewal that took 35 years to complete, but whose silhouette communicated permanence and confidence to every observer. Wren also designed 52 new parish churches throughout the rebuilt city, their varied and imaginative steeples contributing enormously to the visual character of post-fire London. Building regulations requiring new construction in brick and stone rather than timber eliminated the combustible medieval building fabric that had made the Great Fire possible, giving post-fire London a more durable, if less organically medieval appearance than the city it replaced. New streets were somewhat wider, drainage improved, and the general quality of urban fabric significantly enhanced compared to the medieval city destroyed in the fire. Commercial life recovered with remarkable speed, demonstrating that London's economic vitality depended more upon its irreplaceable geographic position and human capital than upon any particular collection of buildings that had existed before. The city was rebuilt stronger. And then something arrived that would transform it beyond anything its builders could have imagined. The Industrial Revolution transformed London more dramatically than any previous development in its long history, expanding its population and physical footprint at rates that seemed almost impossible to contemporaries attempting to comprehend what was happening to their city. By the mid-19th century, London's population had grown to over 2 million people, making it by far the largest city in the Western world and one of the most populous urban concentrations anywhere on Earth at any point in human history. Railways arriving from every direction brought both people and goods into a city that became simultaneously the financial engine, administrative center, and commercial hub of an expanding global trading network. The Thames itself was transformed by the demands of industrial-scale commerce, with new docks, the West India Docks, the East India Docks, the Surrey Commercial Docks, constructed east of the city to handle cargo volumes that overwhelmed the ancient riverside wharves developed for earlier commercial scales. The Tube, the world's first underground railway, opened in 1863, addressed the practical impossibility of moving the city's enormous population through streets already overwhelmed by horse-drawn traffic. Charles Dickens documented the social realities of this industrial London with a novelist's compassionate precision, revealing the poverty, overcrowding, inequality, and human suffering that existed alongside extraordinary wealth and imperial self-confidence. Joseph Bazalgette's magnificent sewer network, constructed in response to the notorious Great Stink of 1858, demonstrated that Victorian London could also produce engineering solutions of permanent value to its entire population. An empire was reaching its absolute height. By the latter decades of the 19th century, London was not merely the capital of Britain, but the effective nerve center of a global empire encompassing roughly a quarter of the world's land surface and population, a position of planetary influence without precedent in human history. The City of London, the ancient square mile within the Roman walls, had developed into the world's dominant financial center, its banking houses, insurance markets, and commodity exchanges channeling capital flows that shaped economic conditions throughout every inhabited continent. Immigrants arrived from the empire and from Europe, contributing to a metropolitan population that was genuinely diverse in ways that few cities anywhere could match, with established communities of Jewish, Irish, South Asian, African, and Caribbean residents, each contributing their own cultural traditions and economic energies to London's complex social fabric. The Victorian building boom created the characteristic terraced housing, parks, railway stations, and public buildings that defined so much of London's current physical character, while institutions including the British Museum, the National Gallery, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and numerous other cultural organizations established collections and educational missions that continue serving millions of visitors annually. The underground expanded throughout this period, its network reaching increasingly distant suburban areas and enabling the residential development that transformed former countryside into the extended London metropolitan area. This was the city at its most confident, most powerful, most imperial, a city that seemed to believe its dominance was as natural and permanent as geography itself. The 20th century was about to administer a brutal correction. Between September 7, 1940 and May 11, 1941, London endured the most sustained aerial bombardment that any city had yet experienced in human history, as German aircraft attacked the British capital in what became known as the Blitz. The opening raid on September 7th concentrated on the East End and the London docks, killing hundreds of civilians and igniting fires that burned continuously for hours, visible from miles away, and guides for subsequent waves of bombers throughout that first terrible night. Over the following months, bombs fell on virtually every area of London, destroying residential neighborhoods, historic landmarks, churches, hospitals, schools, and commercial areas, with indiscriminate destructiveness that specifically targeted civilian morale. St. Paul's Cathedral miraculously survived the bombing largely intact, its dome rising above a landscape of surrounding devastation, in images that became among the most powerful visual symbols of British wartime resistance. The human cost was devastating. Approximately 30,000 Londoners were killed during the Blitz. Hundreds of thousands were made homeless, and an estimated 1 million buildings were damaged or destroyed throughout the metropolitan area. Yet, the response of Londoners to this sustained assault demonstrated something remarkable about the city's character that 2,000 years of previous testing had never quite exhausted: a collective refusal to accept that destruction and death represented the end of anything rather than simply another chapter in a longer story. Air raid shelters became impromptu communities. People returned to homes that had been bombed. Life continued with determined normality wherever normality remained achievable. The city begins rebuilding once again. The London that emerged from the Second World War faced reconstruction challenges as daunting as any the city had previously confronted, with widespread bomb damage compounding decades of inadequate housing investment to create a genuinely desperate shortage of decent residential accommodation for millions of people. The post-war political consensus, reflected in the establishment of the National Health Service and the expansion of social welfare provisions, also shaped London's physical rebuilding through ambitious public housing programs that constructed thousands of new homes throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Tower blocks, high-rise apartment buildings that their designers and political supporters genuinely believed represented a rational, modern solution to housing density challenges, transformed the skylines of many London neighborhoods, replacing bomb-damaged terraces with vertical residential developments that varied enormously in quality and that subsequent generations would evaluate with complicated and often critical perspectives. New towns were established beyond London's boundaries, designed to absorb population growth and provide planned, modern alternatives to the overcrowded Victorian terraces that progressive planners considered inadequate by contemporary standards. The physical rebuilding proceeded alongside cultural reconstruction that gradually transformed London's self-image from a battered imperial capital, adjusting to radically reduced international circumstances, into something newer, more confident, and increasingly culturally influential on a global scale. The 1960s brought a cultural explosion centered partly in London that made the city synonymous internationally with musical innovation, fashion, photography, and a broader youthful energy that attracted global attention disproportionate to Britain's diminished political and economic power. A genuinely global city was emerging from the ruins. The London of the early 21st century is a city that would be genuinely unrecognizable to any previous generation of its inhabitants, yet carries within its geography, institutions, and cultural character unmistakable continuities with every preceding era of its long history. Approximately 9 million people live within Greater London's boundaries, speaking over 300 languages, representing virtually every national, ethnic, and religious community on Earth, creating a metropolitan diversity that is simultaneously one of the city's greatest practical assets and most significant ongoing social challenges. The financial sector centered in the city and Canary Wharf. The latter, developed from former docklands during the 1980s and 1990s, positions London as one of the world's 2 or 3 most important financial centers, alongside New York and Singapore, channeling capital flows of extraordinary scale through institutional networks that would have been familiar in purpose, if not in technology, to the Victorian bankers who operated from similar addresses a century and a half earlier. London's universities, University College London, King's College, Imperial College, and the London School of Economics, prominent among them, attract students and researchers
Fine wares from the north,
contributing to
indeed
intellectual
a
and
thriving
scientific
port.
achievement that
Fresh
maintains
goods,
the city's
best in the
position
city.
as a global
A
knowledge
fine
center.
day for trade.
Creative industries, tourism, healthcare, technology, and public services collectively employ millions of people across the metropolitan area in an economic structure dramatically different from the industrial and imperial economy of previous centuries, yet no less globally significant in its reach and influence. Its greatest strength, however, remains something simpler and more human than any economic statistic can capture. Strip away the Roman walls and the Norman Tower, the Tudor palaces and the Victorian railways, the Blitz-damaged churches and the glass office towers, and what remains as the constant throughout London's entire 2,000-year history is simply its people, the generations of ordinary men, women, and children whose daily lives, accumulated across centuries, constitute the actual substance of everything the word London means. The Roman merchant who unloaded amphorae of Spanish olive oil at a Thameside warehouse in the 2nd century. The medieval guild craftsman who served his apprenticeship, learning a trade that would support his family for decades. The plague survivor who lost half their household to a disease no one could explain or treat, yet continued living and working in the city that had delivered such devastation. The mill worker who arrived from rural Ireland during the famine years, found lodging in a crowded East End tenement, and built a new life through years of hard labor. The child sheltering in an underground station during a Blitz raid, listening to bombs falling somewhere above and emerging the following morning to find their street altered but their community intact. The nurse from the Caribbean who arrived in post-war London in response to advertisements from the National Health Service and spent a career caring for a city that did not always welcome her arrival as warmly as her skills deserved. These people, named and unnamed, remembered and forgotten, are the actual architecture of London's history, more fundamental than any stone or steel structure the city has ever raised above its ancient riverbanks. One final chapter remains to gather all their stories into a conclusion. Empires came and went throughout the long centuries of London's existence. The Roman Empire that created Londinium eventually withdrew, leaving behind walls and roads and the crucial decision that this particular river crossing deserved a city. The Norman Empire that William built over conquered England transformed and eventually merged into the English kingdom it had conquered. The British Empire that made Victorian London the center of a global system reached its peak, declined, and ended, leaving behind institutions, architectural landmarks, and cultural legacies whose significance continues evolving in ways that historians will be debating for generations. Kings ruled, and their kingdoms changed around them. Henry VIII demolished monasteries and reshaped the spiritual and physical landscape of a city that had been organized around Christian religious life for over 1,000 years. Fires raged with devastating completeness. Boudica's deliberately set destruction, the accidental catastrophe of 1666, the deliberate destruction of the Blitz, and each time London rebuilt, sometimes better, always differently, always with the characteristic determination that seems to be written into the city's fundamental character. Bombs fell from unprecedented heights onto a city that had never faced aerial attack in 2,000 years of previous warfare, and Londoners responded with a combination of genuine suffering and genuine resilience that became perhaps their most famous historical characteristic. Every generation that has ever lived in this city has faced its own version of the same fundamental challenge: to maintain, improve, and pass forward a place worthy of the extraordinary history that preceded their particular moment within it. London is not simply a capital. It is 2,000 years of resilience written in stone, steel, and the lives of millions.